All right. Hey everyone, how y'all doing? Is this our first second day, right? Yes. Hopefully you're having a good week here at Cisco Live. Welcome to the Cisco U Theater. I am Kareem Iskander. I lead technical advocacy with here at Cisco Learning and Certifications, and I've been with Cisco for a while, 16 years now. Done a bunch of things. I was 7 years in DevNet when DevNet was started, and been about 2 years here in learning and certification. I focus on technical advocacy, advocate for the learner, our certification, and I wanted to talk to you today about Splunk. We made a huge investment in Splunk. Majority of us are familiar with Cisco and what Cisco has um, from controllers, from our network, and I wanted to show you the kind of a way of how we integrate Splunk in that kind of Cisco ecosystem. Okay, and so I'm going to give you a quick introduction on kind of position where Splunk is, and then we're going to talk about Splunk observability. We're going to dig into the different types of Splunk deployments. And then we're going to look at how we can start configuring that data link in order to get data out of our infrastructure and into Splunk. Then I'm going to go do a live demo, and we're going to connect an instance of Splunk and show you how easy it is to get it into Meraki as well as Catalyst Center. Okay. Hopefully I can fit this in 30 minutes. So let's get started with it. Okay, so I want you to think about this scenario. You are planning a date night, and or maybe you have to you want to go out to dinner. A typical logical kind of process is you check the weather out as a data point. You see what you're going to wear. Potentially go and do a check reviews for the restaurant you want to try out. Maybe see if there's reservations. Check the menu for any allergies or anything like that that your family or yourself might have, and then get to the restaurant and potentially order. If you think about all of this, is all of that are data points that we do kind of naturally in our day-to-day to make a decision, right? And so think of that when it comes to our infrastructure. We want to have we want to have a kind of single pane of glass to be able to get all the data points from our infrastructure, from our network, and from our network devices into a massive database, essentially, to be able to query it, to be able to look at path, to be able to see and make decisions and see what's happening under from our application all the way down to our infrastructure. And this is where Splunk comes in play. It allows you to do data-driven decisions. Just as we consider date night and tasks to choose for the restaurant, it allows you to organize that data required for to make operational decisions. When it comes to our huge enterprises, right, whether you have multi-site, you have multi-deployments throughout your entire infrastructure, you want to be able to aggregate all that data to essentially find out what's happening with your user, find out who's accessing your dashboards, find out who's making changes to your dashboard, potentially find out alerts from your infrastructure and any events that are happening, correlate that and be able to pinpoint where the issue is so you can have a better user experience in general, right? And so if we look at Splunk observability as a whole, it starts from the application layer where you essentially have application monitoring with APM, where you inject an agent in the application in your code itself to run tests to see what's going on with your application performance and save all of that log into Splunk. And then it can traverse down. So it could go down to your infrastructure via syslog monitoring, right? Where you can connect it to your syslog and see what's happening with your infrastructure. If your application is not performing properly, but it's not an application issue, you got to start debugging and seeing what's happening underneath the hood. So this is where kind of the full stack observability with Splunk comes in handy. And we Cisco have integrated Splunk with App Dynamics for kind of your on-prem APM observability. We have integration points within our Cisco controllers that control your infrastructure for syslog and monitoring of your infra, as well as integrating it with AI ops to say, hey, I have this massive data. I can do search query, but then if a query, I hit that kind of threshold, or I detect a threat or something, I can send that out to AI ops to be able to allow it to kind of intelligently tell me how to remediate the issues that I'm seeing. Okay, so this is kind of what Splunk is in a whole. What we're going to focus on here for our session, we're going to focus on our log analysis and infrastructure monitoring. Okay, and so there are a couple of pieces to that. So I want you to look at this. So you have Splunk. Think of Splunk as a giant database. You have some type of data collection architecture, and that data collection architecture matters depending on what you're trying to connect into Splunk. And then you have all your infrastructure, whether you're running Catalyst Center for on-prem deployment and manageability of your devices, or maybe you're running Meraki for cloud deployment and you're managing it that way, or you're even managing your devices via a script that you wrote, right? Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a controller. As long as you can get data syslogs out of that, you can connect it into Splunk using the data collections that we have. So for what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys about the different types of Splunk deployment. We're going to hone in on the data collection part of Splunk and see how we can actually connect our different platforms into Splunk. And then I'm going to show you how to get Meraki and Catalyst Center data out of the controllers and into Splunk using the different forwarders. Okay? Just a show of hands here. Who's played with Splunk or has done something with Splunk? Okay, so I'm glad you have some background, but this is a great session for you to get started and understand where it all plays out. All right, let's look at the Splunk deployment. So from a Splunk deployment perspective, there are two options. We have the Splunk Enterprise, which is basically your on-prem deployment, and the Splunk Cloud, which is a cloud instance of Splunk that you essentially go pay a subscription to Cisco, and you have an instance that you can manage. If we look at the Splunk Enterprise itself, there are two types of deployment, and the types of deployment are essentially dependent on how big of an enterprise you're running, right? So the number of users are going to be accessing Splunk, the amount of data that you're going to be pumping into Splunk, how many indexers you need, and what kind of forwarders you're going to be using, okay? And so if you are a small enterprise running a single instance of Splunk seems logical. A single instance of Splunk would give you forwarders in one place. Forwarders are basically your data inputs, what are going to allow you to get data into Splunk. Indices or indexers. The indexers are basically, think of them as a database that allows you to index the data coming from the different platforms. And then the search head, which are basically the services that allows you to query the data within Splunk that belongs in the index. Okay, so in a single instance, when you deploy it, all of that comes with it. Now, if we're looking at deploying multi-site or potentially pumping a bunch of data into Splunk, this is where a distributed model comes in handy, where you basically decouple your forwarder, indexer, and search as different services, and you have redundancy behind these services in case you are pumping a bunch of data that these services are running low on resources. You can bring more services up or destroy them. So think of them as containers of the different types, the different services that are within Splunk that are deployed, and that they can be deployed in multi-site. So that's your Splunk Enterprise, okay? For the sake of our conversation, I'm going to show you how easy it is to deploy a Splunk Enterprise in a sandbox environment. Now, if you don't want to have to manage any of that, you have the option to go out and get a Splunk Cloud instance. And what's great about this is you just pay a subscription. The cost of Splunk is, and this is something to keep in mind while making decisions, is the cost of Splunk is typically based on the amount of data that's going to be pumped into Splunk. That's how it's charged, right? And so it's subscription based. You can go out today with your CCO ID, register for a Splunk.com account, and they'll give you 2 weeks of Splunk Cloud trial that you could do whatever you want with it. What I appreciate though is if you are an AWS or Azure or GCP shop, you have the option to use different cloud providers for your Splunk instance. Okay. So these are our deployments. Now, here's a simple way to basically stand up an instance of Splunk and get started. You have to, and by the way, all of this is the instructions and everything we're going to cover today is on Cisco U. I wrote a tutorial that I'm going to give you the link to after this session, so you don't have to worry about this. You can just do it when you get back home. Okay, so it's as easy as that. Go out and set up an installer, whether you're going to run it on a Windows server or you're going to run it on a CentOS. In this case, I downloaded an RPM. Once it gets downloaded in the default directory, you run RPM-I for interactive, and then essentially installs the services and Splunk for you. You can set this up on your local machine if you'd like. It's not, if you're running Linux or Mac, you can get the version and do it. Once you have that Splunk installed, it's going to take about 15 minutes to set up. Before you started, you got to be mindful to go in and you have to configure a Splunk administrator so you can log in. In this case, you go into the user seed.config file and you basically supply edit that config file. You supply an admin and you supply a username and supply a password, save that file, and then you're all set. Now, at this point, your Splunk instance is ready to go, and you can simply go and start it by calling this command, basically the Splunk service start. And that's as easy as it's going to get for a Splunk enterprise. Whether you can install this in production or you can just install it similarly in a sandbox. That's how easy it is to get Splunk up and running in your environment. Okay, so this is our first part. We have Splunk running. Now we want to start getting data into Splunk. So we have a couple of options for data, and I want you to understand this. Splunk has two different kinds of forwarders. They have a universal forwarder and a heavy forwarder. So a universal forwarder, basically think of it as a bus that transfers data from point A to point B, right? And it's a UF essentially is a lightweight, minimal resource usage, ideal for collecting and forwarding log data. So the way it works for universal forwarders, you basically go in Splunk and say, hey, I want to create a receiver. That receiver is going to basically receive all types of data that I send its way. I want you to open a specific port for that receiver, and I want it to be at this address, IP address. Once you've configured that receiver is attached to an indexer, which is basically your database, right? So a receiver is attached to an indexer. From this point on, you can give this IP address to your end user or to your admin to configure in the different platforms that you want to start collecting syslog from. So universal forwarders are super simple to get started with. The issue with universal forwarders is it does not filter on anything, which means, and we go back to Splunk charges you per gigabyte of data that you have in it. You don't have the mechanism to say I don't care if I don't need an event to be sent out to Splunk when a user logs in, or I only care about when somebody changes my configs, right? You don't have a mechanism to do so because it's basically everything, right? And so this is where heavy forwarders come in handy. So heavy forwarders are basically a full Splunk enterprise instance with indexing disabled, which means you have to go in, configure a heavy forwarder, and there are different types of heavy forwarders I'm gonna talk about. But you go in and configure it and say, I want you to take some action to the data that's coming in before it gets saved into Splunk and it becomes searchable. Okay, and so there are different kinds of heavy forwarders. You have TCP forwarders, UDP forwarders. What I'm going to focus on here today is HEC, or HTTP event collectors, and these are really, really useful, very flexible way to basically get data out of your platforms, take some action, decide which ones you want to pump into Splunk, and then have it be indexed and have it be searchable in a search head. Okay. What's great about heavy forwarders, again, is it allows you to parse data before it goes in. One of the things that you could do is within Splunk itself is you could write a custom script in Python, attach it to Splunk heavy forwarder, and say, I have a URL, I have a token, and anytime any events hit that URL and token, it's going to go first to my Python script. I'm going to do something to that JSON likely, or XML, and then based on some logic I apply to it, I'm going to decide whether I want to save it in my indexer or not. Okay. Does this make sense? All right, I'm 15 minutes in. So this is how essentially, so I said I'm going to focus on HEC. And the reason why I focused on HTTP event collectors is because it plays really nicely with Meraki and Catalyst Center. Within Meraki and Cat Center, you have the option to say, to go configure a webhook, right? So you can go in the platform in the Cisco controllers, say, I have a webhook. You guys, I hope that you guys are familiar with webhook. We've been doing DevNet for years now, so you should know what webhooks are, right? So you go configure a webhook. That webhook essentially says anytime in Meraki and Catalyst Center, you actually attach whatever events you care about to that webhook. And so whenever that event is triggered, it's going to go out. And if that webhook happens to be your HEC, then that event is going to be sent out into Splunk. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we're going to go into Meraki. We're going to first go configure a HEC in Splunk. We're going to take the information from Splunk, go into Meraki, and say, I'm going to configure a new webhook. That webhook is the Splunk URL with a tokens for authorization. I'm going to go back into Meraki and say, I want to be selective of the alerts that take place for that specific webhook. And once the alerts take place, I'm going to send them out to the HEC endpoint. And the HEC endpoint is going to process that and save it into my indexer. And it's going to be basically available for us in the search head. Okay. So this is basically, these are the first steps that we're going to take. Is basically we're going to go in, create a new authentication, new token to authenticate. We're going to create a new HEC in Splunk. It's going to look something like this. And I want you to keep in mind of something. So two things. If you're doing this in production on your side, Meraki requires a valid cert for it to receive these webhooks, which means Splunk allows you to use HTTP or HTTPS for their HEC. If you use HTTP with Meraki, the webhook would never be received because Meraki is looking for a valid license, valid certificate on your Splunk server. Okay, so that's one gotcha that you got to be mindful of when you're doing this. The second piece is Splunk is going to generate basically a webhook collector with a URL that we're going to take with the token, and we're going to configure it in Meraki so we can send out those alerts. All right, so we covered how we get data into Splunk itself. Now let's cover the configuration of Meraki itself and Catalyst Center, okay? And then we'll put it all together in a demo. So if we look at the Meraki, there are a couple of things that Meraki supports. Meraki supports syslog protocol, and this is where universal forwarders are useful. So if you have a universal forwarder configured in Splunk, then you have an IP address, you have a port, you can simply say, go into the syslog configuration in Meraki and say, here, whenever anything happens, here's the URL that I want you to send the JSON data out to. So that's where it's going to send that log data for within Splunk. This is the problem. Like, it goes back again to there's no filtering on this, but excuse me, the one that we actually want to do is the webhook configuration. So we're going to go in, filter on a specific webhook. One of the things that you should know, Meraki, when you configure a webhook in Meraki, you have to configure a template. So if you're familiar with, who's familiar with Jinja 2 templating here? Okay, so think of it as a templating language, which basically you say, I'm going to create a template for all of my alerts that are going to be sent out. That template is going to be basically have placeholders where I'm going to replace the values that are coming out of my Meraki dashboard, and then that JSON is the template is in a JSON format, is going to be basically be sent out to Splunk, and the JSON is going to be available there. Now, Meraki uses liquid templating, which is a type of templating very similar to Jinja 2. If you're not familiar with it, it's an open source templating. Shopify came up with it for their website, and we implemented it for Meraki. So once that happens, we have to go into Meraki itself and say, hey, give me the alerts that I care about, and push them out to via webhook to the heavy forwarder, and then we're going to use the heck URL and token for that. So it's simple as that. And then very similarly, right, you can, and you can think about this, you can, as you're designing your Splunk instance and your data collection architecture, you could say, I want everything to be in my main indexer, where whether it's coming from Meraki, whether it's coming from Catalyst Center, I just want it to be all together so I can search it. Or you can create different indexers for the different platforms, and then you can basically go out, build reports and dashboards from there within Splunk. But the same idea takes place in the Catalyst Center. The Catalyst Center, they call it something different. Again, it's the same method of webhook, but you got to go in and create a destination, right? That destination is going to be basically your webhook collector, which is Splunk in that case, or Splunk Heck to be specific. And then you're going to go into the alert configuration section of Catalyst Center, and you're going to say, okay, I have a destination. I want to select whenever OSPF basically protocol changes. I want to send an alert out, right? So you're going to select, OSPF changes alert, and you're going to tie it to that destination we configured, and job's done. Now, anytime these alerts take place, they're going to be available for us in Splunk. Okay, so let's go look at this together. I'm going to focus on Meraki, and then I have about 10 minutes. Hopefully we get through the Meraki portion. I'll show you Splunk, and then I'll show you how to do it in Catalyst Center. Before I get started, any questions on anything that we just discussed? Okay, so I have an instance of, can you guys see this in the back? Okay, so here's my instance of Splunk that I stood up. If I go over to settings, and if I go to data inputs here, you can see all of the different collectors that we talked about. This is what we want. We want to go build out a new HTTP event collector. So you can go click on this, and I want to show you we have TCP, we have UDP. Scripts is where you can write a Python script as a heavy forwarder, and you can leverage it that way. But we're going to go collect a bunch of webhooks here. So you can simply go there. You generate a new token. So I already have mine configured with the instance of Meraki that I'm going to show you, but I'm going to walk you through how to do this real quick. So you go in and you say, I want a new token. You need that token in the URL so you can configure your webhook. Cisco Live Heck. A couple of things here. If you enable indexer acknowledgement as part of your heck, you're going to have to put a specific header in your liquid templating in Meraki for it to be able to authenticate, right? So be mindful of that. In this case, we don't need to pick it. This basically, it does every time there's an event that gets fired, it validates the token before it saves it to Splunk itself. And so I go next. Here's where you basically say, I want to tie the data that's coming into an indexer so I could start searching it. And so you can go create a new indexer or a new index, or you can use the main is the default one. In this case, I have a Meraki index that I created. I'm going to tie it to that. The other thing is the source type is important, right? So if you know that you're getting JSON payload from your webhook, then you can simply go in and select the source type as JSON. And they support obviously an automatic, so they can detect it. For some reason, when I was doing this and I did it on automatic, the JSON did not get rendered properly. So if you specify and you know exactly what's coming out of it, then you can use it. And then you can simply review it, and that's it. That's all we got. So at this point, we have our token. And if I go back to settings, data inputs, and my HTTP event collectors here, you can see that now I have my hack here. I have this one. That's the token that I want to be able to take over to Meraki and start configuring those alerts that I want into Splunk. So let's head over to my instance of Meraki. This is, I'm running, I cannot get access to my sandbox, so I just fired up my home network here. And if I go in over to basically network-wide general, this is where we configure the syslog universal forwarder. So if I go down here, but we're not doing this, I just want to show it to you. So if I go into Meraki itself and under reporting syslog servers here, I can add a syslog server. This is going to be my universal forwarder address. So I'm going to put in my IP and the port, and anything that happens in Meraki dashboard is going to be pushed out automatically to Splunk. So that's the easy one where you don't have to filter anything. What we're after is configuring the webhook itself. So if I go into where was it? Here we go. Organization, APIs, and webhooks. Here where I could configure actually my actual webhook. So I could go in and say add webhook receiver. If I add a receiver, right, I'm gonna give it a name. The URL is essentially our instance of Splunk with port 8088 service collectors. This is part of the heck that we created. And I want you to pay attention to something. If you want the data to come raw, unfiltered, with no actions taken to it, use the /raw configuration or /raw endpoint for your heck, and that would allow you to basically get the JSON untouched with all the timestamp and everything. So in this case, this is what I'm using. And then the shared secret is essentially the token that we have generated here. So this would be my token. And then you will have to create a template. So under the template tab here, you have to create a template. This is the liquid template that we talked about. Oh, that's not pretty. So if we look at the template here, it's basically nothing more than a placeholder. You have to configure the header. Splunk requires you, in order to authenticate, you have to pass the keyword. I'm not sure if you guys can see it here, authorization. And you have to use Splunk as a keyword followed by the token itself, which would get passed, since we're building the template, would get passed from global into this. And then this would generate essentially a webhook data. So at this point, I have all of the pieces I need. If I go in now into into organization and alerts, here's where I can filter on which alerts I care about to go to Splunk, right? Which means I could go here and say, so they must have just changed this on us. But here you can essentially go in and configure the alerts on to say what type of alerts you want. If your AP goes down, maybe you want an alert on when a switch port changes speed. We can do all of that. And so if once you have these two hooked in, you can simply start seeing some data getting integrated into Splunk. If I go here and I go in Splunk and I do search your data, I know there are some events that were triggered because I've had this hooked up for a while. I'm gonna go search on index, my Meraki index, because that's where the heck is gonna be pointing to. And if I search this, you can actually start seeing data being populated from my Meraki dashboard with the events based on the template that we put together. And from there, you can start watching for events. You can start specifying reports based on these events and building a dashboard that you can share with your exec, or maybe have a dashboard as part of your administration. So I'm at time. I don't have time to show you how to get into Catalyst Center to hook this up, but I did have, I'd like to walk you through real quick if you have a minute here. I did ooh, here we go. So in Catalyst Center, I'm not sure why it's zoomed in. It's zoomed in this much. All right. In Catalyst Center, you essentially could go and say, I'm going to go in and create a destination. That destination, again, is going to be my heck collector. I'm going to give it the URL and the server name and authorization here. Once that's done, I can actually go in the settings and say, I want to go look at the destination. Once the destination events are set up, I could go into the events in Catalyst Center and pick what do I care about from an events perspective and point that out to the REST API to the destination we just created. And that's whenever any of the events that happen in Catalyst Center are going to be pumped into that Splunk indexer that we just configured. Okay, I know it's a lot. If you scan this URL or this QR code or go to u.cisco.com, every single step that I talked to you about here today is in that tutorial. Check it out, try it out, and see if, get your hands dirty with Splunk. Hopefully you learned something new and you enjoyed this session. Thank you for coming to the Cisco Youth Theater, and enjoy the rest of your week. Appreciate it.